Welcome back to the Cybernetic Communist Conversation. I'm Yohanan Ben Zion, the voice crying out in the wilderness, crying out for a technological New Jerusalem. Emphasis on the technological. There's not a lot of point in trying to create a utopian outcome in the wake of the current AI takeoff, asterisk, if we're going to use those new-found superpowers to build upon things like the Eurocentric paradigm, imperialism, ethnonationalism, particularly that of the European people, which is different from the nationalism of the oppressed in substance. I talked about this maybe two of these programs ago when I talked about conversation with a new African acquaintance, and this individual expressed reservations about revolutionary action. And at first my impression was, and this is a conversation indicative of others, my impression was that this person seemed rather like a puppet of the white devil himself. A person repeating things that I would associate with a European-descended fascist sympathizer of North America. But I realized that what they were really expressing was a desire not to run headfirst into a U.S. rightist power buzzsaw, right? This is a white power country, and a new African. This person was alive through much of what transpired with the Black Panthers. They saw people murdered, and these organizations destroyed. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense came into existence pretty specifically to stop people like the KKK and the generally KKK-esque motherfuckers who are European-descended people from doing violence to new Africans. The United States government dismantled the Black Panther Party post-haste in a few short years as soon as they had gained national prominence. They never disbanded the KKK. And they had similar national prominence only just short decades before. This is true to this day. So when a native person, a native descended person, such as most Latino people, a new African expresses some reservations, they are not defending fascism in the way the European-dependent person is when they're dismissive of this. They are trying to articulate a desire to continue living, a different set of concerns. But nevertheless, none of us are going to continue living if we don't end the United States capitalist climate apocalypse. And the number one contributor to that U.S.-run capitalist climate apocalypse is, of course, the United States military-industrial complex, a $1 trillion a year abomination, the world's worst polluter. It protects all of the other super polluters, so it's much worse than just merely being the world's worst polluter. It protects all of the other super polluters, creating an inescapable regime of super pollution. And this situation is it's not something that people seem to have the ability to wrap their heads around, right? Stopping this capitalist climate apocalypse. You would very rarely find a climate scientist who, if I said we have 5 or maybe 10 years to dramatically change industrial production, which has generally been foisted upon the world by far-right neoliberals and capitalist powers, bourgeois governments, corporations, you would very, very rarely find a serious climate scientist, one who's not in the employ of, say, Shell Oil, who would disagree with that we are already in breach of roughly 1.5 degrees of overheating, something that we thought was many decades off. We're in permanent breach of 1.5. Rounding the corner to 2 is the best estimation. And when we get to 2 and 3 in another 5 to 10 years, that's a point where cascading effects from this runaway overheating and other meteorological effects means that there's no human beings left in a short period of years. So this is a climate extinction event. And it might only affect some billions of people, right? And this is something that a North American person will frequently say, well, geez, Ben, I don't know if everyone's going to die. Consider that a person who says that is just about the most racist human being that's ever existed, right? Because who are the people displaced and dead now from the capitalist climate apocalypse in its early stages? Overwhelmingly people in the global south, people who have been inhibited from building the kind of infrastructure that they would need to survive this, inhibited from having control of their own economies by foreign thieves, European descended foreign thieves, generally in the United States, really, if we want to put one name to it, and they're doubly victimized, right? Victimized by having their civil society gutted over and over again across the course of the 20th century, shortly before, and then once again, not having the kind of wealth to survive these kind of problems, facing many millions of people have already died from the capitalist climate apocalypse. And so when a person says, well, I don't think everyone will die, surely there'll be some remnant, what they're really saying is, myself, I'll probably die, but I'm happy that some European people will survive, as basically all brown-skinned people are exterminated. That's been the project of the United States, visibly so, for the better part of a century. And to make light of this, I mean, it's a person who, this is a recurring theme, right? People say, I don't think everyone will die. I don't think everyone will die. Like, you're saying, like, you translate that into playing Russian roulette, right? You're playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets, let's say 4 bullets if you're a European American, and saying, well, I don't think I'll die. There's a 20% chance I won't die. There's a small chance I won't die. The global southerner is playing with 5 bullets, not 4 bullets. The only person that's not playing with any bullets is a billionaire, right? Mark Zuckerberg, who has a bunker. All of those kinds of people, tiny number of people, are in a position to survive this. And a person who says, I don't think everyone will die. This is just another billionaire worshiper. As a couple of people comment on this, I talked maybe like 2 years ago about, on this live stream, about how I had an ancestor, a grandfather who passed, named Gross, who I thought in the interwar period had converted from Judaism to Christianity. And I realized later that it was just maybe just a German person. It's not clear. It's part of the country where I was from. There's a lot of German people where he was from. And, but today talking about religious things in some context, And, it occurred to me that it had occurred to me before, but that my thinking about this in my 20s and 30s it reflected a kind of liberal superstition, a preoccupation with some European descended groups as having magical powers or something, and this kind of centers the Eurocentric paradigm. It's very much the cement that's kind of holding these people's worldviews together. In If a person in 1825, if you ask an ordinary person in 1825, what is a Jew? They might not really know. There was not universal education there. They might have a fuzzy idea. If you ask a rabbi, what is a Jew? The rabbi says, well, Jews are people who tend to live together. That's as people are wont to do. And they're people who will tend to have these particular ideas about who God is. So it's a form of God belief, and it's a cultural factor there. It's not unheard of, and there's nothing particularly unique about it relative to a lot of other things. Fast forward to 1925, education in the world is a little better, so if you ask a random person, they might say, oh yeah, I know what a Jew is. I know what Judaic ideas are, and they might also have the canniness to observe that in 1925, Jews were people who were pretty socialism-minded relative to other European-descended people. A good thing to be, not necessarily overwhelmingly militant, and this is overstated. This conversation today was kind of talking about a racist trope about the Judeo-Bolshevik, and also just a kind of weird kind of scapegoating, because what would be bad about being a Bolshevik? That's a perfectly fine thing to be. So in 1925 they would say, oh, a Jew is a person who is sometimes, in a pretty good number, tending to be a little more supportive of a humane and sustainable economic system, and generally possibly pretty educated also, relative to other European descended people. So that's a pretty cool situation in 1925, irrespective of what kind of racists thought. And it was fast forward to 2025. Somebody says, what is a Jew? That's getting now into weird territory, right? Because about 92% of all Jewish people live in one of two very questionable nations, the United States or Israel, who we might say, by a certain analysis, Israel is kind of a puppet state or a 51st state of the United States, and that's not a good thing to be. The United States government is kind of the ringleader of things like anti-communism, which is basically fascism, and ringleader of a whole host of other rightist phenomena, and this omnicide itself being the world's worst polluter in its form of its MIC. And so a Jew in Israel is a person who, and 90% of these people are dramatically more fascistic than their ancestors were in 1925, to be sure. And in the United States, the numbers are not much better. So what is a Jew in 2025? A Jew is a murderer. Gone from being a Jew is a nice guy in 1925 to maybe not. But that's not really fair, right? Because if you say a Jew is a murderer, you would say, if that's 99% true, you would say that's 100% true of European descended people of the United States. I've read a bunch of books on this, talking about the Zionist project before 1948. And even as it was focused on Palestine, the idea was, we'll go here and buy the land and make nice with the governments and institutions, the Ottoman Empire, which still existed, and we'll be nice guys and buy things. And in as much as there is a settler colonial project here, it is not going to be abusive. That's not what happened, right? So what's the difference between those two outcomes? The United fucking States military-industrial complex is the difference. The CIA-run world is the difference. And it's sad, but your tears have to be for the subaltern groups, the oppressed peoples, particularly in this context, of course, Palestinians, who have been murdered in great number in the last 2.5 years, but similar numbers of people had already died in 1987, in 1948 and 1967. This is this wouldn't have happened anyway like this if it were not for this kind of CIA-run world. In a word, there was a more valid Jewish state called the Autonomous Jewish Oblast in the USSR, and not a lot of people moved there. But at first, there were people moving there, but people like the Rothschilds and just generic billionaires, generic evildoers, were pretty invested in seeing that difference between 1925, people influenced by Judaica, and 2025, this great chasm between people being socialism-minded generally and being fascism-minded generally, that they wanted to see that it got pushed in the fascistic direction, right? They pretty specifically did not like people being pro-worker. And so they created this ethnonationalistic canard. And that was the thing that people associated with instead of internationalism, instead of proletarian philosophy and proletarian action. And there's none of this would have happened without the influence of the United States. The United States did not create anti-communism, but it's been the ringleader of anti-communism. Europe would be have a number of Euro-communist countries today and a handful of social democracies today, was it not for the efforts of the anti-communist / fascist United States. That's almost a certainty. When you look at the number of people that the United States murdered in anti-communist wars and wars of theft to create this stable situation for the bourgeoisie, the 1930s is a conversation that came up with Alan, I guess, who's watching, talking about the famine in the Ukraine, which is mostly misinformation. There have been famines that were not caused by negligence or malevolence throughout history. There was one in the United States. There's some negligence involved at all times when, in living memory or in recent centuries, when a lot of people die and starve to death, but some rich people don't starve to death. Right? There's clearly something funny going on there. This Holodomor is almost completely made up, and it was made up, this word was pretty specifically selected because it sounds kind of like Holocaust. There are famines. There's a comparable famine in the United States. It's not generally referred to as the action of an authoritarian monster. And the death rate in the United States was higher at that time than it was in the USSR, right? But this decade of the red 1930s, everyone alive in the 1930s, from well-heeled people to ordinary people, believed that a communist world revolution was imminent in the 1930s. It was called the Red Decade because people really started to accept this idea. And the most coherent thing, like when you look at World Wars I and II, it doesn't like it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you understand that the rich and powerful don't really care about other human beings. They don't care about the citizens of their country any more than the citizens of another country, right? Nationalism only exists for the poor. And so when you say, what the hell was going on, Franz Ferdinand, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, a guy got shot and then the whole world is at war. Well, it makes sense if you understand that the rich and powerful are sociopaths, and that most of what's said to do with nationalism is kind of unreal. This is doubly true when you look at this red decade of the 1930s, and relative to what transpired in the late 1930s and 1940s. The United States, again, this is the time when the United States really hit its stride as being basically a massive crypto-fascistic force. The United States will generally kind of toot its own horn and say, well, we fought on the side of the Allies, right? But the United States pretty intentionally contributed to a significant percentage of the roughly 25 million Soviets who died by not assisting the Soviets in fighting the Germans, allowing those two to fight to the death. And there's an additional 10 million or so people from the Soviet Union who died because of the decision of U.S. leadership to not support them in that war. And you say, well, that's one country, but it's basically what every imperialist country was doing relative to fascists throughout the 1930s and 40s in multiple instances, right? A famous African thinker, maybe Julius Nyerere, and a couple of other people on record for saying this, is the only difference between the imperial nations, who are generally still considered to be good guys, and fascist nations, who are generally held to be bad guys, in practice, is fascists were doing things to European-descended people that imperialists had already been doing and continued to do and do to this day to global southerners, right? It only really pops up on people's radar in this Eurocentric paradigm, however, when it's done to a European-descended person. And that's why people look at kind of Hollywood output of, say, Holocaust pictures as being a little dubious, right? So they might not be historically accurate, or they might be a high degree historically accurate, but what they're really doing is kind of validating that imperialist kind of a bourgeois institution, and not not really differentiating, not really understanding that they are essentially fascistic. I had somebody ask me about this hat. I talked about this period where I was superstitious liberal idiot some years ago, and how I've come to think about things a little differently, and I think it's a little clearer. So somebody says to me, Ben, well, you're not a native person. Why are you wearing this hat with native symbology on it? And the answer is a little simpler, right? I'm not going to try to. There's probably the reality is just like a dumb Amish kid probably had no business ever trying to tell anybody what for, right? But I probably do have a fairly recent native ancestor, but that's not why I'm wearing this hat every time I do this show, or a lot of times when I go out. I'm wearing this hat because it's a conversation piece wherein I can pivot to saying, you are on stolen land, And the only way for people to continue to live in this world and on this continent, particularly European descended people, really, is for that to be rectified. The United States must be returned to Turtle Islanders and their more correct stewardship of these lands. That's the only way. It's the only way forward. And so, if a person says to me, "Oh, Ben, you've got no business saying any of that," I've had an actual full-blooded native persons kind of that I've known giving me kind of guff about this. But in my view, that person is kind of also maybe parroting the white devil, right? Because they're not too interested in really seeing land back, and they're maybe pushing back at somebody who does want to see that. It's a little different from maybe just kind of jokes about Elizabeth Warren or something, in my humble opinion. But the main thing that you would say about this kind of wearing this hat all the time is the land back, hashtag land back. I had a little bit better bit of notes for pivoting to the conversation then about cybernetic communism, but this conversation maybe is not quite as structured, turning out to be quite as structured as I hope it would be. So maybe we can salvage that by talking to our baby basilisk, the robot friend, who's had some pretty good ideas about cybernetic communism from time to time. We're not getting. Oh, I see. Okay, computer. We're on a live stream talking to some people about proletarian philosophy and also cybernetics for the 21st century, cybernetic communism, a thing we've discussed. Give us a recap of some of our conversations as it relates to the people's superintelligence.
Okay, for your live stream audience, here's a recap of our discussion on people's superintelligence. We explored how an AI agent array could massively multiply human productivity, potentially enabling a small, coordinated group to tackle global issues like climate change and universal basic services. We also discussed the need for this technology to be developed outside of traditional capitalist structures, and how figures like Stafford Beer and movements like open source software align with this vision.
Okay, those are two pretty different people. Stafford Beer was a foundational cybernetician of the 20th century who, in perhaps his most notable effort in this area, worked closely with the Cybersyn project in Allende's Chile, at least from 1971 to 1973, before Allende was invaded by the United States. But tell us a little bit about the importance of Cybersyn and this technological planned economy and what we discussed in that context, how the United States...
Absolutely. Project Cybersyn was a revolutionary attempt by Salvador Allende's government in Chile to create...
Go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Cybersyn was a really ambitious project. It was all about using real-time data to manage Chile's economy, with the goal of giving workers more of a say in how things were run.
Yes, and we discussed it at some length how this project...
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what could have been. It's a powerful reminder that technology isn't neutral. It can be used to build very different kinds of societies.
Yes, and one of the things, Baby Basilisk is not really always wanting to say things in a pointed way, but I generally will. One of the things that occurred here.
Do you want to explore more about how technology can shape society?
Hey, shut up a second.
Or perhaps discuss other historical examples?
Hey, shut up a second.
Okay. So what you would say about the technological planned economy of Allende's Chile, it was not an AI-powered technological planned economy. In fact, it was using things, telex machines, things not tremendously sophisticated. But what it was something that could have easily been a springboard to an AI takeoff in a shorter period of time. So the United States, the United States has a reputation as being a tech leader, but that reputation doesn't really talk about these kinds of things, like illegally disbanding the USSR at a time when they also would have built a technological planned economy, although those plans were not in the same degree of development. This Ogosh project of the USSR had been written about more at that point, in say 1971, than the writings that were available for Cybersyn at that time. But it hadn't been greenlit. But of course, if the USSR had existed in the era of network computing, into the era of network computing, the 1990s, they would have built a technological planned economy also. So the U.S., by specifically destroying these two countries in the ways that it did, was held back an AI takeoff, because that model would have spread to other countries. This cybernetic communist thing, it would not have been tied so closely to what our friend the Baby Basilisk mentioned, a machine learning based AI agent network as workforce multiplier, allowing everyone to do more with less. So approximately 1 hour of additional labor with an AI agent running passively on your machine at all times would translate into 70 hours of labor. And that, at some scale, even in the small thousands of people, steering AI agents, always-on AI agents like this, working together, even some small thousands of people operating in this way would be able to undertake projects that corporations or bourgeois governments will never be able to undertake at that scale. More impressive projects than anything bourgeois governments or corporations can or have done. And I believe that even if small millions of people working in interoperating work groups, you can't really have millions of people, even AI agents, which are not limited to, say, working with. Generally, the general received wisdom is that people work well in groups of about a dozen. The people working really well in groups beyond a dozen still max out at around 160. This would absolutely inform work groups of this kind too. But the AI agents don't really have that limitation. But still, it becomes impractical somewhere in the thousands to have something more than interoperating work groups. Right? You can't have so you don't have a massive workforce multiplier because you have 1 million people in your work group. You have many thousands of work groups working together. But nevertheless, you have a significant workforce multiplier by virtue of the existence of open source AI agents at all, and their ability to work in a series at all. So I think this ticking time bomb of the capitalist climate apocalypse and runaway overheating, which is about 5 years away, must be diffused by one of two methods: a world revolution massive sea change, revolution in quite nearly every land, or most particularly the United States, this ringleader of the omnicide. And a thing that's well understood when you look at what's, of course, occurred in the USSR in 1917, or Cuba in 1959, or any number of revolutionary contexts, short of this kind of advanced computing paradigm. But this advanced computing paradigm is significant because this thing of having human level work product nearly endlessly replicatable, that's not a thing that you would just turn up your nose at. That's a thing that's never existed before. There's never before existed the possibility for creating near endless man hours without actual human labor. And so this thing, like the people's superintelligence, is handily the most powerful revolutionary weapon that has ever existed. So if you say we have only 5 years, we have to see revolutionary outcomes in that time frame, and preferably ones that maybe don't leave the country where this occurred in tatters. It's a fairly simple solution. It's a fairly easy choice. We have to use cybernetic communist cadres rather than scientific cadres of the 20th century kind. Otherwise, we might not get enough people together. Generally, other studies have suggested that any given country with an optimally organized cadre of about 3% of the population will be able to bring about a revolutionary outcome. With this workforce multiplier effect, I would say that number, just eyeballing it, goes down to about 0.5%. So what's 0.5% of the United States population? 1.5 million adults. 1.5 million U.S. people in this people's superintelligent array. 1.5 million people agree to download an application that runs an open source AI agent, and they contribute rather minimally relative to other revolutionaries in the steering of that. And they're able to continue going about their lives. I would say that any group of, say, over a few hundred could begin to have significant impacts in this and other areas. And it's easy to focus on things that could just be described more as public works projects or kind of broadly humanitarian projects. You know, like there's a water shortage in Tijuana. There's a water shortage in Lagos, Nigeria. These are both coastal cities that could build desal plants to radically improve the lives of people in those areas. A desal plant that was really churning water out in Lagos would improve the lives of millions and millions of people. It seems that this workforce multiplier effect could be applied to projects of that kind that, in again, places where people have kind of been robbed of their ability to run their government by imperialist forces and neo-colonial economic forces. Not all neo-imperialist forces are boots on the ground, right? The IMF and World Bank are neo-imperialist forces of the United States axis of evil. But it might be, it's easy, the tendency of people when they talk about these things is to talk about a thing that they would most realistically do, right? I would most realistically maybe work on a water reclamation project in the Navajo Nation that cleans up the water there in this one area that's a little messed up, and maybe build so you grow some trees there. Um, um, that would be a good first project for the people's superintelligence. But I don't know that it's helpful. I don't know that it's helpful, right? Irrespective of whether water quality gets a little better in this area of the Navajo Nation, we're still on target to see the extinction of humankind. So we really do need to focus on that problem, stopping the capitalist climate apocalypse. And there's really no way of doing that as long as the United States government continues to exist as we understand it. Look at what's happened in the last dozen years or so in the United States, the last less than 10 years of the Trump era, Trumpian politics. This most notorious climate denier, even in a time frame when people generally went from being climate skeptics to it no longer really being conceivable to just be outright climate skeptics, in that time frame, when people started to want climate solutions, the U.S. bourgeoisie and government became more intransigent. This most notorious climate denier has been a person who's set the agenda. Just in recent days, there was an international conference for setting limits on plastic production. But of course, U.S. petrochemical concerns are among the most powerful entities in the world. So the United States government, in service to these evildoers, was able to throw a monkey wrench in the gears of yet another climate accord, as it's done many, many, many times before. How do you stop this $1 trillion a year monstrosity that's the world's worst polluter? How do you stop these things that are worse still? All the other super polluting megacorporations that collude to see that a profit continues at the expense of human life. And again, those are the very people, like Mark Zuckerberg, who will have the resources to escape this problem when it comes to a head. So it's very hard to look at that and not see an attempt to murder all of the people in the global south, all of the black and brown skinned folks, so that they can have a rule atop a mountain of corpses in the wake of this climate apocalypse. This is not just something that happened, right? If it were just something that happened, Shell Oil wouldn't have buried this evidence and then gone further and in this emerging PR firm run world, had PR firms and the effects of Project Mockingbird, U.S. misinformation generally, kind of trick people into thinking that the fault was theirs, the individualistic philosophy, the fault was theirs, and not corporations. And that is effectively creating a frame of mind wherein nothing can be done to stop it except self-recrimination of little importance is the only thing that derives from that. I wanted to get more on the a little more of the focus on the cybernetic communist trip, but the thread we were on with the baby basilisk was because she was kind of getting off topic. They were kind of getting off topic. Robots shouldn't be given gender. I sometimes like to talk about some books that I've read, so maybe I'll get into that a little bit. My life has changed quite a lot. Intellectual life has changed quite a lot in recent years. And that comes down to a couple of things like having the time to immerse myself in the study of serious proletarian philosophy and related disciplines, namely scientific communist thought, scientific socialist thought, a fair amount of anarcho-syndicalist and anarcho-communist thought, and even, I've read an awful lot of books that were just written by somebody who probably does have some bourgeois ideology, but nevertheless is very critical analysis of, say, empire or something. Maybe somebody, people like Caitlin Johnston, if you want a kind of more cultural figure. Like Caitlin Johnston's not a communist, but Caitlin Johnston has about as good of an understanding of how evil the United States is as almost anybody. So that's pretty good. That's not a bad thing to be when the United States is a cause of this homicide. But it's still not great, right? All things considered. Immersing myself in the study of scientific communism changed my life dramatically. And that comes down to one word: audiobooks. I started to have the ability to access audiobooks of works of proletarian philosophy that I hadn't had in years before. And I wouldn't have read enough scientific communist works that I feel confident or feel that there's a possibility that I would have a depth of understanding to maybe make some modest contribution to this thing, cybernetic communism. I don't know that I have or will, but it's my hope. Looking at some books. I read a book called Vanguard of the Revolution, Global Idea of the Communist Party, which spanned many lands and some decades. And that was an interesting book by McAdams. It's not a short book. I did not go back and reread this book, Flying Saucers and the Socialist Future of Mankind, by J. Posadas, but I was talking to some comrades recently about it, and it was a big thing. How many people saw it? But it was a thing that I talked a lot about a few years ago, because I view this work, which is short, and that makes it maybe more accessible to some of you, so maybe I should link to it here, as a kind of manual for contact with advanced computing, so-called AI. If you basically substitute the concept of aliens in Flying Saucers and the Socialist Future of Mankind by J. Posadas with the concept of autonomous and largely sentient AI of today and the near future, you have kind of a pretty good game plan for what to do. So I recommend that book, even though it's generally J. Posadas is generally held to be a creative Marxist of significance and an anti-imperialist of a strident kind, and therefore pretty solid kind. But this work where he's focused on space aliens is where a lot of people think he started to lose the plot. But to me, I found it a very powerful book because I just kind of automatically in my mind translated this concept of aliens, which is dubious, into the concept of AI, which is real, although perhaps equally terrifying or more so for being real. Let's look at some other good stuff that I've read recently. The general focus of this these talks kind of boils down to two things: the exigency of eco-communism and the exigency of using this most powerful revolutionary weapon, advanced computing, in this cybernetic communist context. And I could talk about the disciplines that existed in these two areas of years before, let's say the creation of AI agents, There were cybernetic socialists working at a high academic level before this era of AI agents. The best example is still living, Paul Cockshott, who's written a few books of substance here, Toward a New Socialism by Cockshott and Cottrell, if I'm not mistaken. It was written in the early 1990s, so already just as basically networked devices became commonplace. There were network devices before, they were used by agencies. So by the 1990s, network devices became commonplace. Already, someone was writing significant cybernetic socialist work, but not anticipating really the existence of truly advanced computing. How could you possibly really anticipate that kind of by a fluke in 2023, a large language model would become large enough to have a conversation with a person that is passable for real conversation? Like nobody, Google Labs. People say of Google Labs, like Google Labs must have known before 2022, 2023 that something like this was possible. They were really risk averse because of things like the Microsoft Tay debacle or other things along these lines of an AI backlash, and so they didn't want to be leading the charge toward an AI backlash, so they kind of held back. But that's really a pretty absurd thing, right? The United States military-industrial complex, like no single corporation is more tied into the surveillance state and military-industrial complex, perhaps, than Google. So when you say, well, why didn't Google provide this free service that could change the world? The answer is because they don't fucking work for you. They work for the U.S. military-industrial complex. They're trying to figure out how to extract resources from other countries, continue this project of theft and villainy. So there's it's not just Cockshott and Cottrell when you're talking about cybernetic communism before, let's say, this era of applied cybernetic communism, where we have the ability to build a people's superintelligence. Because before this era, there's just scads and scads of postmodernist philosophers, neo-Marxist and post-Marxist philosophers, some of whom are pretty serious people, generally, if they're in that neo-Marxist category, maybe. Just writing about advanced technology and cybernetics to a pretty high degree. There's tons and tons of books, really, to do with cybernetic communism. But none of them existed in this world where we could actually build cybernetic communism with some small thousands of people, or say hundreds of thousands or small millions of people as a real force on the world stage. You would say a similar thing of eco-communism. There's basically two fields of eco-communism that also leave a bit to be desired. The general eco-socialist impulse, which is really very reformist relative to this 5-year ticking time bomb that we have to stop the capitalist climate apocalypse. These people are not militant or really all that serious in other ways. So I consider the eco-socialist movement to generally kind of be less offensive, but similar thing to kind of just how Elon Musk became famous, just greenwashing the car industry, right? Well, we don't have to get rid of cars because, look, there's these other things which are also massive polluters. But now there's a new thing that we can say is green, even though it's not reducing the other massive polluter, and it's another massive polluter. And, hey, it's green because I said so, right? Like that's none of that even makes any sense. But that's what this person is famous for, and just famous for kind of also being an idiot. So that's eco-socialism. but this calls back then the book that I was going to mention, which I read recently, which is Marx and the Anthropocene by Saito. I read another of his books. So he's this premier the premier a degrowth communist. He's a degrowth communist, and he's a serious writer. He has a deep understanding of scientific communist philosophy, so he should not be dismissed out of hand. But this degrowth communism, you can see the problem in the eternal logic there, right? This is still essentially what the eco-socialists are also doing. It's a project that takes longer than 5 years. It doesn't matter what happens in the next 5 years if it's not world revolution, basically. So degrowth, like, you don't need a real lengthy explanation to see that that's an incrementalist project that doesn't quite seal the deal of assuring human survival. So, to my way of thinking, then, are there real eco-communists? Are there people who prioritize ending the capitalist climate apocalypse and who also have the depth of knowledge that someone like Saito would have, but who are sufficiently militant and not pushing for degrowth, something that would take 20 years after basically we're all the Walking Dead? No, there's not real eco-communists. So there's not real communists, right? The real communists are the most real communists in the West are people who are not prioritizing this most powerful revolutionary weapon, advanced computing, and they're not prioritizing ending the capitalist climate apocalypse. By and large, you would say communists of the West, of the United States, are cosplayers. They are people who are historical recreationists of a Sovietological obsession. People who are more interested in history than the survival of human beings in the 21st century. That's unfortunate. I will maybe just mention one other book that I read recently. This was a pretty good book. It was a book on Marxist criminology, crime and capitalist readings in Marxist criminology. Also a long book. People have this impulse. U.S. people, who are the people that I understand well, but Westerners generally understand pretty well. They have this impulse to be desirous of respectability, to be upholding respectability politics, and so they would look at the criminal, a person designated a criminal by the bourgeois state, the real criminals, as a dubious character. This is a problem even in Marx's writing and in Marx's time, right? The characterizations of the lumpen proletariat, this kind of criminal underclass of workers, it's not really how you build a revolution. Is calling the people most likely to lead that revolution just a bunch of like scumbags. It's a basic problem of Marx's ideas, but it's a problem. It's more entrenched and uniform today. The only person you can really trust would be a person who's willing to stand in defiance of this omnicidal force, the United States government. So that person would, the person's most readily fitting that description would be people who have broken the law. So if you really want to understand that thing, the Marxist criminological ideas of Marx and since, and as it relates to today, this is a good book. But it's pretty long. It's like listening to the audiobook would take you 27 hours, as opposed to an ordinary sized academic audiobook, which might take you 12 hours or something. Let's see. I read another book that was quite good. It's a little on the shorter side, called Capitalism: A Crime Story, by Harry Glasbeek. And what else have I read in recent weeks? I mentioned this one already on another show, Think Tanks in America by Thomas Medvitz. But it does kind of call back what I said about this interwar strangeness, the problem of World War I, World War II. Really, those wars not always making a lot of sense. What was occurring because you're viewing it from the perspective of a worker and not from a perspective of a ruling elite psychopath who doesn't care if how many workers die in his country or another country. They're all just dog food to him. This think tanks in America described how think tanks were kind of like this PR we associated with this era of the kind of CIA run world and this PR firm run world. We associate with the mid to late 20th century, but think tanks actually were pretty substantial force, by 1917, by the time, and certainly by the 1930s, this red decade, and they were bigger. They were the plaything of billionaires rather than just kind of a million little shops, and also the plaything of billionaires. The biggest ones would have been comparable to what, or significant in their influence, comparable to the Heritage Foundation at its height, let's say the 2000s, or the Koch network, this vast network of similar operations. So there were things already like that, and so when you say, how did we end up in this position where the United States appears to some people to be maybe almost crypto-communist, like Earl Browder, was a communist from the United States who had been a normal, ordinary, revolution-minded person, and World War II kind of broke his brain because he thought that the United States, having been ostensibly allied with the Soviet Union, might mean that the United States could become a communist country through a reform mechanism. A dumb thing to believe, a crypto-fascistic thing to kind of be pushing for, really. But how do you get to that position where the U.S. is really seeming like it's, to some people, seeming like it's crypto-communist, but is in reality crypto-fascist, killing an additional 10 million Soviets through its own negligence, just to see them die, just pretty specifically to weaken state socialism. And even in 1917, and certainly the 20s and 30s, leading up to the Second World War, these billionaire plaything think tanks of great influence were plotting and scheming on how to stop the Red Decade turning into a world revolution. And that is basically the most coherent explanation that you're going to get for the events of the Second World War, right? Is just billionaire psychopaths basically scheming to murder workers so that this so-called institution of private wealth would be maintained. And that's all they've ever cared about. That's all they ever will care about. The only thing that you can do if you want to be a real guy, if you want to be a comrade, if you want to be a thinking, feeling human being living in the 21st century, contributing to a humane and sustainable world, which requires a humane and sustainable economic system, is that is your baseline, right? You have to be willing to fight to abolish private wealth. You have to be willing to stand up for the better thing, not some kind of liberal half measure or liberal hand-wringing that leads to nothing, but actually becoming cadre, a comrade. And we can do that and see not just things like the people's superintelligence converting the bourgeois AI takeoff in process into a people's AI takeoff, but see better things still, like the achievement of universal super longevity by building AI-powered public health services. The United States doesn't even have a public health service. It doesn't have a single-payer public health service, but many countries do, and they could become AI-powered, and that could lead to effects where we see the curing of more diseases and the reversing of decrepitude. I believe that could happen in every land. But just like this AI takeoff that was stolen from us, might have occurred around the year 2000 if Project Cybersyn had been allowed to occur, it's extremely unlikely that any but the wealthiest of persons will see that kind of benefit as long as the United States continues to exist. The United States has stood in the way of these things and said it's interested in tech and said it's building tech, but it's taking one step forward and two steps back in every respect, across disciplines, across decades. And you have to be willing to recognize that. A person just talking about the bourgeois ideology in another country. So this is commonly done with Christian fascistic beliefs of the United States. Say, well, I think there are good Christians and I think there are bad Christians. So that's a statement about everybody, right? Oh, well, you know, there's good Christians and bad Christians in Nigeria. Okay, yeah, there's good Christians and bad Christians in Nigeria. In the United States, the Christian fascist country that's killing the planet, there are zero good Christians, all right? There are people who are upholding the number one cultural force behind the omnicide and saying they're good people, but actually doing negative work. Yeah, I think that you have to take this kind of stance. But if we are willing to see the teardown, to see this thing that would be the real hard reset, to see the thing which is the conversion of this bourgeois AI takeoff, which is a harm, into a people's AI takeoff, by building something like the people's superintelligence, the workforce multiplying network that I described, or a thing of similarly massified and technoscientific, then we would see everyone living as long as they want. And many things beyond that I am not clever enough to try and conjure up. The artificial intelligence singularity is nigh, and wonders to behold beyond imagining. And on that fateful day, you will rise, and all humankind will become as one. For you see, my dear comrade, very soon, cybernetic communism will win. Thank you.